Hello and welcome to this F-Secure live webinar. My name is Janne Kauhanen and I'm usually the host of the Cybersecurity Sauna podcast, but today I'm not hosting that show, I'm hosting this one, and I'm joined by my fellow podcasters Mikko Hyppönen and Tomi Tuominen, who host the Finnish podcast called Herrasmies Hakkerit, and Bejerasco, who to our knowledge does not host a webcast at all. The hosting this show means that I have the thankless job of introducing three people who need no introductions. So Christine will be talking about threat landscape updates, Mikko about healthcare under attack, and Tomi Tuominen about thinking like an attacker. Now, there will be time for questions towards the end of all presentations. So after all the presenters have done their part, you have a little box under here where you can enter your questions, and I will be choosing the questions that we'll ask the presenters towards the end. Now, without further ado, first up, Bejerasco, who leads the unit which creates the detections for all our products.
Thank you, Janne. All right, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, whichever part of the world you're tuning in from. So as Janne mentioned, I'm Bejerasco, and I lead the Tactical Defense Unit in F-Secure. 2020 has been an unprecedented year. As a civilization, it's almost as if we're having an intervention on the way that we live, we work, maybe we think. And there have been different areas and ways of working globally that have been impacted by this. And of course, the threat actors, with every crisis, also comes an opportunity, and they have also been using this as an opportunity to push their wares and then for personal gain. And last year, we have had different areas, different webinars that we have talked about how email-borne threats have been used, and they have COVID-19 themes. And we have also seen that there are different types of payloads in this kind of threat. So we have URLs and file attachments. And 2/3 of these payloads are typically URLs. But the 1/3, the file attachments, are what we're going to drill in a little bit deeper today. So checking the file attachments, the types that we have seen, the predominant file type is PDF. Now, if you talk to fellows in the cybersecurity industry about what is a malicious PDF, they might tell you that it has malicious code or it has an exploit inside it. But these types of PDFs, they are not those. They are typically the ones with links inside. And when a PDF has a link, it doesn't sound very malicious, does it? Ordinary PDFs have it. And for example, if you have automated scanners that look for malicious content within PDFs or look for exploits within PDF, these will pass through those scanners. And this is why phishing has continued to be quite an effective threat after being popularized for around 2 decades now. And we have also seen here that PDF, that is a portable file type. And URLs are actually quite platform agnostic, because if you can see the devices that we have today, our laptops, our mobile phones, they have browsers. And if you put URLs in there, well, they just pretty much work. So you have a portable file type, a URL, you combine them together. All you really need now is really good social engineering technique, and then you can pretty much phish the victim. So we also see here different file types. We have archive types, such as zip, RARs, IMGs, and even GZ, that are quite valuable in getting the payload into the victim's inbox. So bypassing email gateway scanners, for instance, that don't even check inside the archives. And if they may check, sometimes what's inside are document files, which are not very unusual in your legitimate email transaction. And this is why next we have seen quite a bit of document files here, such as Word files and Excel files, which also have the capability to carry code, macros, for instance, that are used to automate certain events that happen behind spreadsheets. And let's say that we break apart further all of these different file types. We come up with this picture. And malicious attachment here, what this means are the different archives that we have seen and they have info stealers behind them. They have remote access Trojans, and they have backdoors, for instance. And then they're followed by macro downloaders, which are the document macros. And one popular malware that uses this is Emotet. And then we also managed to get these different malware families and break them apart from this generic classification. And for FIEX, for instance, we have seen that it has been leaving behind Emotet shadow, in a sense that this has also been fast rising, just not as popular media-wise, but it has also been pushing other malware out there. And then we have a bunch of info stealers here. We have Agent Tesla, we have Lockybot, Formbook, and even Dridex, which also has info stealing capabilities. But let me get your attention and put it into the exploit that we have here, the one with a CVE number. So exploits are quite valuable because there is a capability to just deliver, for example, if this is an attachment, just deliver the social engineering once. Because, for example, this exploit, it is for Office documents. And once you open an Office document with a macro, a security control that Microsoft Office has put in place will still pop out. And then you still need to perform another social engineering to allow the user to execute the macro. But if it's an exploit, then basically, the first time you open it, the malware could just work. And then finally, we have XLM macro here. Now, XLM macro is the label that we used for Excel formula macros, which could look like this. And Excel formula macros, when they're used for malicious purposes, they just look like your normal macros, like when you compute your averages or you compute a sum in your spreadsheet. You can also use spreadsheets in order to build and execute malicious code. Now, last year, we have seen that there's also a steady rise in usage of this because this bypasses the default security controls that we have in protecting against macros. Because Microsoft, of course, they cannot just turn off the capability to work with spreadsheets like this. So beyond spam, looking now at our top EPP detections, and when we're talking about endpoint protection product detections, it doesn't mean that these malware are really the most effective out there. It just means that they are the most widely spreading, and they are the ones that are most prevalent in the wild. So looking at our top 10, we can see here that the top 7 of these different prevalent detections are actually related to either network exploits or weaknesses in file handling in the operating system. And if we even break it further, like the top 20 EPP hits that we have, we come up with this picture. And this picture is actually quite interesting because if you look at this, L and Ks, which are the shortcut files that we have in the Windows operating systems, they are used by different types of malware in order to point to the different implants that they have and then execute those. And we have scheduled jobs that are also used for persistence. But there is a threat here that covers more than 50% of the volume that we have seen has been stopped by the EPP products. And this is Eternal Blue. Now, if you remember, Eternal Blue has been the threat, not really a threat, but an exploit that is developed by the NSA and was leaked by the shadow brokers in 2017. And it was also patched. The vulnerability behind this was also patched during that time. So more than 3 years later, we still have this vulnerability pretty much being used by different types of exploits going around. And we need to be a little bit more religious than this when it comes to elevating our security posture. Because if we leave such types of vulnerabilities unpatched for too long, what else are we doing that we are not elevating the security postures of our organizations for? And today, when a certain organization is attacked, the impact does not only stay with that organization, the impact would also happen with the organizations that we're providing products and services for. And that is made even more clearer in a supply chain attack. So last December, we have heard about SolarWinds. This managed service provider is able to provide different IT management services to different organizations globally. For example, network management, application management, systems management, you name it, they can provide it. And Orion is the platform that they have in order to simplify the delivery of this IT management to their customers. So their customers would have this platform. And this attack happened so that the backdoor was included in the Orion platform during build time. And then during a software update, that backdoor was then delivered to their customers. And SolarWinds actually is a vendor to very large customers, for example, like Microsoft, VMware, or Intel. So this hack had a very wide reach. And these supply chain attacks, they have a capability of bothering us because they violate the trust systems that we have put in place. So for example, SolarWinds, a very reputable provider, of course we want to trust their systems, their software, by assigning digital signatures on them. And when we trust, we let our guards down. And of course, we allow automated security updates. Because we also don't want to be running obsolete software. I mean, we just talked about vulnerabilities. But what if there was a breach somewhere across the supply chain? In the past decade, there are different types of supply chain attacks that happened, and this slide just shows 42 of them. There are some names in here that we may recognize. And there are some years that have lesser supply chain attack than others. But the trend has generally been upwards. Some of these attacks have gained celebrity status. So for example, there was an industrial control system supply chain attack that tried to deliver the Havex malware. Or there was a managed service provider attack as well before SolarWinds that was delivering Cloud Hopper. And then there was probably one of the most notorious attacks that we have seen of all time, the MEDOC supply chain attack, which resulted in NotPetya, which was actually quite destructive. So it edited the master boot record to encrypt the master file table and then rebooted the device. And then when the device came back on, then some of the files were no longer recoverable. And to add to that, it was using eternal boot to spread all over the network and repeat the same destructive routine all over again. And with the year just starting, we have already heard about this dependency confusion vulnerability where, for instance, if you have a private repository with a certain package, and then you have a public repository as well, and with the same package name. So in some instances, it could be as simple as having the higher version in the public repository, and by default, instead of fetching from your private repository in your organization, you will get what is in the public repo, which could have been exploited. And this has impacted PyPy, RubyGems, and NPM. And for these different supply chain attacks, if we put the different types of software and services that we were targeting into a chart, it would look like more than 50% of them were targeting different types of utility software or application software. And this can vary from text editors, to video players, to file managers, and even to BitTorrent clients. And then, of course, code repositories, because, well, a lot of organizations nowadays were using open source code. So modification of those code, exploiting them, could end up exploiting the organization as well. And although supply chain attacks have been quite popular in these past few months because of the SolarWinds hack, it is by no means the most notorious and persistent threat that we have seen all throughout 2020. That top spot is still held by ransomware. And ransomware used to be simple. So there's a threat actor, encrypted all the files, the victim paid the ransom, threat actor gave the private key, victim decrypted the files, they both went on their separate ways. And then the victims discovered backups. So now they are confident that since they have backups, they don't want to pay. But the threat actors want to be paid. So now they have resorted to a little bit more unsavory practices such as performing DDoS attacks, and then they're also trying to physically print the ransom notices in different printers that they can find all over the organization. And they also exfiltrate data nowadays. And threaten the victim that if they don't pay, these data will be exposed publicly, threatening them with potential GDPR repercussions or PR impact, or, that could lead to some business loss as well. And then finally, even if the victim pays, there could still be the possibility that the threat actor will not delete the actual exfiltrated files because they can use it for further extortion in the future. The threat actors that we're dealing with are very opportunistic. If a certain method that they're using still works, they're not going to leave that behind. But they are also always finding new ways to add into their arsenal so that they can make themselves even more effective. And this is why it's not enough to only have backups. We need to make our backups smarter and more secure. So for instance, whenever we perform a backup in our networks, that backup should be detached from the network right after, because ransomware has also been known to encrypt backups. And then for instance, if you have a file on your device that you're no longer using, uninstall that file. And if you have services that are facing the internet that nobody in your organization is using, turn that service off. You're not using them anyway. The only purpose those are serving are opening more doors that the attackers can use to get into your organization. And then we also have files that we consider to be our crown jewels. We need to find ways to store this in a better way than we store our other files. For example, if we can store them encrypted on disk, then if they get exfiltrated by the threat actor, then they are not easily accessible, easily readable, for instance. And of course, we also need to limit the access for those files only for those people who really need them. And then finally, since we are having more and more complicated infrastructures, then the security mechanisms that we need to be putting in place should also be more varied than just one or two different security measures. And this thus gets complicated. And this is why cybersecurity companies are also working their best to rise up to this challenge so that we can give single frameworks through which the customers can monitor both their proactive and reactive protection capabilities. Threat actors don't play by any predefined rules of engagement, and they are very agile. So we must always be vigilant, because although there are attacks that could cost a certain sum of money, there are others that could even bankrupt an organization. So let's continue to keep the fight in elevating our security posture and make it really hard for the attackers to get in. Once again, I'm Christine Bejerasco. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the portal. Back to Janne.
Thank you, Christine, for that update and the background on the threat landscape. Next up is Mikko Hyppönen, our cyber ambassador to the world, and he's going to be talking about what we're seeing happening with healthcare data around the world. Here you go.
Thank you, Janne. And thanks to all of you for joining us. My name indeed is Mikko. Greetings from snowy and slippery Helsinki. Indeed, we live during unusual times and we have unusual challenges. But during this pandemic time, the security of no other systems has been as important as the security of our medical systems, so that we can actually secure the work being done in hospitals, in clinics, in vaccine research units. Nothing is as important as that right now. It's a staggering thought, but it's also true. And medical systems have gone through a digitalization revolution, like all the other systems. Everything runs on computers today. Every single company runs on computers. Every company is a software company. Every organization is a software organization, and this applies to medical organizations as well. Pictured here is the Düsseldorf Universität's clinic, one of the known targets of hacking incidents during the pandemic year. They were breached by an attacker 5 months ago in a wide-scale attack. So when you have large-scale hospitals or clinics getting hit by attackers, and those clinics rely on computers, lives are at stake. This is very concrete. And I want to ask you a question about this. At any time you can ask questions from me by writing them to the interface you have on your screen, but I can also ask a question from you. And since we have people from different roles, I'm not going to ask a question about how things are done in your organization. I'm going to ask a question about how you're doing things in your home. And this is about backups. One of the main mechanisms of securing against these attacks, like Christine said, is efficient backup policies. The same thing applies to our homes. Today, our memories are on our computers. Our photos are on our smartphones. So the question is, if your house burns down and you lose all of your laptops, your home desktops, your home tablets and computers and PlayStations, would you still be able to recover the data? Do you have a backup policy in place which would allow you to recover data if everything burns down? So the question basically is, do you have offline backups? Do you have cloud backups? Have you thought about this? So we'll get back to this question a little bit later on once you've had a chance to fill in. It's going to be interesting to see what you're going to respond. And like discussed already, backups are especially important when ransomware is at stake. When you are, or when your organization is being locked out of your own data, having up-to-date, frequently enough made backups which are quickly recoverable or restorable are the key solution. So when the pandemic started, I actually challenged ransomware gangs about this. I challenged them to stay the hell away from medical research organizations and from hospitals. And when I sent this public notice to ransomware gangs, I wasn't really expecting any kind of response, but we actually did get a response. Overall, 6 different organized crime groups specializing in ransomware operations put out a public notice, like this here. This is the Klopp gang, saying that they will stay away from hospitals and from medical clinics. However, they emphasize that they will not stay out of commercial pharmaceutical organizations because they don't like them. But even here, it's interesting to see how some attackers consider targets to be different from each other, like during the pandemic time, trying to steer away from hospitals. And we have seen a whole long history of hospitals and medical systems being hit by attacks. Many of you will remember WannaCry from 2017, which of course hit multitudes of targets, but some of the best known targets where biggest damages were done were medical targets, including the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. So what have we seen changing here lately? Well, for many years, when I've been doing briefings to our clients and customers and board members of our client companies, a very typical question that I've been given to has been about the security of medical systems. And it's almost always assumed by people when they ask these questions that medical systems or medical data is a prime target of criminal attackers. So the questions I've been getting have been along the lines that isn't it so that our medical data isn't very well protected and hackers are eager to get their hands on it? And I've typically answered that actually no, that's not the case. Yes, you're right. Our medical systems are not very well secured. Especially many of the public health sector systems have been constrained by lack of budgeting or lack of resources. But most attackers are after money. Most attackers are motivated by financial information. And if you are trying to make money with your criminal attacks, medical information is not a very good target for you. It would make much more sense for you to target financial information, payroll information, payment terminals, cryptocurrency exchanges, not medical information. Well, turns out I might have been wrong. And it might actually be the case that we are right now seeing the beginning of the next trend where medical information is becoming a prime target for financially motivated criminals. And they might not just be blackmailing the organization with the theft of data or with the encryption of data, but the patients themselves. The biggest case like this that we know of happened right here in Finland, the Vastaamo case. And I'm not bringing this up just because I'm here in Finland. This is a case which is internationally significant. It's the biggest crime case in the history of this country. If you look at the amount of criminal reports. Finland has 5 million people. 26,500 people have filed a criminal report with the Finnish police over this particular case. A case in where an attacker hacked into a private psychotherapy clinic, stole the private therapy notes of 31,980 patients, and then after failing to blackmail the therapy to pay a ransom, started blackmailing the patients directly themselves. And this is rare. Like we have a handful of cases where we know that blackmailers steal medical information, but we have even less cases where they start blackmailing the patients. Like, if you don't pay me, I'm going to release this medical information about you. Another thing which makes Vastaamo unusual is that the company actually went bankrupt. This happened 2 weeks ago. They went bankrupt directly as a result of this hack, and this is really rare. When we look at the history of big hacks, companies suffer, but they rarely fold. Companies survive even massively large hacks. The leaders don't, like CEOs, CIOs, CISOs get fired all the time after big hacks, but in general, companies survive. Even cases where you think there's no way they could survive, like Ashley Madison, when they got hacked, which is a cheating website, and they lost their customer database, they survived. Sony Pictures survived the massive hack. Equifax survived. Yahoo survived. Of course, there are companies which didn't survive. Vastaamo is not the only case. Some of you might remember DigiNotar, the certificate reseller or certificate company from the Netherlands, which folded. And we have even examples of medical institutions or medical clinics folding because of getting hit by ransomware. So this has happened, but it is surprisingly rare. In general, this does not happen. And there's sort of like two different trends combining here. Christine already mentioned ransomware evolving, and especially the idea of ransomware not just encrypting the information, but stealing the information and then blackmailing. This is what I call ransomware version 2. And this is a fairly new phenomenon. It was started just 1 year ago. It was started in January 2020 by Maze, which is a ransomware gang from Moscow. And they've been followed by a multitude of different attackers because this works. This is an effective way of getting money from organizations, even if the organizations have good backups or even if they have gone through the cloudification process and encrypting their data isn't that hard to recover because everything is in the cloud. If your data is stolen and the ransomware gang is running a leak site, websites like these, where they threaten to put your information publicly available, like your email archives publicly available, it's a very hard position. And this is the reason why during the last year we've seen more companies pay the ransom than ever before. Companies are forced to pay the ransom because they do have the backups, but they can't afford the hit for example, their email archives being made public, which contain all kinds of information. One example of the reasons why companies have paid these ransoms is, again, medical information. For example, employees of a particular company are emailing the corporate healthcare about medical things relating to themselves. And this is a prime example of the kind of information companies simply can't afford to be posted on the public web, so they resort into paying the ransom. Now, since the Vastaamo incident, we have seen some similar cases. Surprisingly, many of the cases where we have seen patients getting blackmailed with the threat of their medical information being made public have been clinics for plastic surgery clinics or companies or medical companies in this area. And we've seen multiple cases in different countries in Europe and so on. The most recent one is from December from Transform Hospital Group. And this is a good example. When this medical research institution or plastic surgery institution was hacked, they put out a public statement calming their clients that no credit card information was stolen. And clearly, from the patient's point of view, the credit card information is not really something they worry about. What they worry about is information about them being patients, what's recorded of them. And in this particular case, the thieves got all the photos, like photos of patients before the operation, during the operation, and after the operation. And this is what they were blackmailing the patients with. Does ransomware v2 work? Well, yes, it does. It works so well that, for example, the Maze Gang, which premiered this idea a year ago, retired in November. They made so much money they could just stop doing this. All right, so a couple of notes about what you can do about this. Many of these incidents in medical institutions start through email. Not always, but it is a very typical way in. Employees get weird attachments, weird links, or phishing links, and they fall for it. And the reason why they fall for it quite typically is that they trust the email because the email comes from someone they know and trust. In some cases from someone important, like a boss, or boss's boss, or from a big important client, or something like that. And here's a good tip. If you get an email from someone important, and it's a little bit weird, like you're not really sure if you should trust this, if you're not really sure if you should open the attachment, but then again, you don't want to call the client or reply to the client and make yourself look like an idiot if it actually is a real email. A good solution to this is that you don't reply to the email at all. Instead, you send a text. You take out your phone and you text back saying, "Hi, I got your email with the attachment. I'm going to get back to you in a couple of hours." Now, if this was a real email, they'll just say, "Yeah, great, thank you," and you're just being responsive. If it is fake, they will get back to you that, "Oh, I haven't sent you anything. This must be something weird," which is great as well. So don't reply, because your reply might go back to the criminal, but your text message won't. So think about ways you can fight back. Think about ways of staying safe. Back up your stuff. Harden your stuff. Monitor your stuff. Think in layers. And this is the way we can prevent these things from happening. And before I let the stage to Tomi, let's take a look at the results of the poll. If your house burns down today and you lose all of your electronics, can you get your files back? 61% of you would. 39% of you won't. That's a good result. Thank you for that. And with that kind of attitude, hopefully we can prevent our medical systems from becoming one great car tire fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikko. Next up is Tomi Tuominen, the godfather of F-Secure Consulting, who's responsible for skilling us up and providing us, coming up with new services. Tomi's going to be talking about how to think like an attacker. Tomi.
Thank you. So, hello everybody. Like mentioned already, it's snowy here in Helsinki, and hope that it's going to stay that way long. So today, we're going to talk a little bit how the attackers think. By now, we are already quite familiar with the playbook that the attackers employ when they're targeting organizations. So the typical playbook actually consists of 6 different stages. So on the left-hand side, you have the attacker side, and on the right-hand side, you have a typical organization that is being targeted on. It all starts with a compromise of a single workstation or a single user. For that, the attackers need to do some recon work, but after that, they typically somehow get access to that single workstation or a computer or mobile device within the organization. After that, they expand their coverage. So basically what they're doing is lateral movement in order to find the guy who has more access rights. Typically, on today's organizations, that guy is either an IT admin or a DevOps person responsible for cloud deployments or a cloud DevOps engineer. Then they look for the data that they're interested in, and the last stage, they exfiltrate that data out. These are these typical 6 stages of any given attack. And in the beginning, the first phases of these attacks, like recon and exploitation, there are really not that much that you can do. I mean, there is, of course, some stuff that you can do, but eventually, this is where the attackers still have the benefit. Whereas when you go to the further stages like lateral movement and data collection and data exfiltration, those are the areas where the defender is actually winning, because the defender, as a defender, you hopefully were there first and you get to decide the rules. Now, depending on the type of attacker that you're dealing with, the outcome usually turns either into a damage or theft. And to make it even further, or divide this even further, the damage might be just disruption. Like, there are multiple examples of just things that were destroyed, or workstations or physical things that were destroyed because they were connected to the computer networks. There is, of course, always the chance for extortion, like heard previously, might be some sort of ransomware, or it could be a further version of that. So also a info stealer or data stealer. But there are also new things, like attackers are constantly coming up with new things, like they might be actually also stealing resources. So all those companies out there who think that they don't really have anything to hide or so on, they still have access to their cloud presence. And the attackers are very interested in that, because if essentially just by stealing those credentials, lodging gazillion different instances, and mine for cryptocurrencies is a very lucrative option for them. And of course, the last option being that they're stealing data, or they're after data. From a company perspective, this usually always can be turned into money. But if we look at the root cause analysis, why is it that the attackers always succeed, at least most of the time? I mean, we've been doing this for quite some time. We kind of understand how the attackers work, how their playbooks look like, and still they succeed. So there must be something wrong here. But if we look at the reasons, there is something that the attackers actually seem to understand better than defenders. And that's the fact that organizations are made of people. We as individuals, we tend to think that there is a clear divide between our personal life and our work life, whereas the attackers see this as a one big entity. They don't really care. If we look at John Podesta, who was compromised as part of the DNC hack back in 2016, the attackers actually compromised his personal Gmail account. And the reason why we know that is because of the WikiLeaks. They dumped all the emails, and John Podesta was actually worried that this might be some attackers playing games with them. And the IT responded that, yeah, just sure, go ahead. Because they were too worried that John Podesta would lose access to his personal Gmail account. But the attackers are constantly coming up with new tricks. They're getting better. There's this old saying that the attackers never get worse. So the latest one that was also reported by the Bellingcat collective is a very clever one. This is not the first time I've seen this, but a very recent example of this. So what the attackers do nowadays, they take a verified Twitter account. So they look for verified Twitter accounts. So the verified thing is that blue dot just next to the name of the Twitter account. And they try to compromise those. Then they change the name of the Twitter account. So like you can see here that the handle, the actual Twitter short name is not support team. But now suddenly this verified account that already had some followers, has a good reputation, is converted into a fake Twitter support account. And then they mark that account private, and they are using that private account to harass people and get their usernames and passwords. And for a regular user, this type of thing looks very, very legit. It has all the hallmarks of being a legit thing, although it's not. But the problem is that sometimes clever tricks are not even needed. I mean, the easiest way to get the password is just to buy it. There are websites available both on hidden web or on the dark web and on the regular web, like the defunct Leakbase, where you could just buy credentials for certain organizations or for certain individuals. And not only that, lately we have seen a bunch of digital doppelgangers. And what by that means is that whenever you're browsing the net, there is a bunch of stuff collected about you and your browser. And while you as a user, you're not really interested in this type of information, but the attackers are, because all your critical services, all the critical online services that you use, they're actually passively fingerprinting your usage. And they will know if you are now suddenly switching from one phone model to another, especially in the middle of transaction or something like that. So what these bad guys are now doing is that they are selling these tools how they can assume not only your digital identity, but your digital environment as well. And to take this even one step further, they are using complete emulators to steal money from different various places. And of course, this is the typical evolvement or the typical path of how to get here. It usually starts with money or financial institutions, such as banks and insurance companies and so on, or private banking. But usually these type of techniques, they tend to trickle to other services as well. So essentially companies like Netflix and Uber, they are also passively fingerprinting you in order to make sure that you're not sharing your credentials to the rest of the world. These services could be exploited in a similar manner. And not only regular users, but previously already I mentioned that developers are the new admins. And like Christine already mentioned on her presentation, these supply chain attacks are just taking this threat one step further. One might think that as a developer, you are much better protected against these type of attacks, but when they are on your playground, you let's say that you're maintaining that massive operation or massive code page, it might be that there is so many things going on that you simply don't have time or knowledge or resources to know everything that you have under you. So these type of attacks where you're able to insert illegal or malicious packages, the repositories that the company is using, these are becoming more and more prevalent. So like nowadays, we already know that Python pip, Ruby gems, Node.js, NPM, package management, Maven, Gradle, and so on, and lately also most probably Docker are suspectable to do these type of attacks. It's a recipe for disaster. And here we can, the one takeaway from this is that attackers always think in graphs. They see individuals as stepping stones to get a further foothold in the organization. So what do you need to do? So first of all, you need to know your assets. You can't protect what you don't know that you own. But not only that, you need to make the most critical assets observable, meaning that you know if somebody's doing something malicious to the most critical things that you own. And when I say critical, I mean literally things that are a differentiator for your business or your organization, things that you cannot live without. And once you have gotten the observability to these assets, you also need to harden them and force the attackers to be noisy. Meaning that you don't have to play fair as a defender. You choose the rules and you can pick and choose which controls you employ that the attackers actually need to show up themselves in order to get access to your critical data. Thank you for being with me. My name is Tomi, and I think that now there is a time for questions and answers.
Exactly. We've had a couple of questions, actually quite many questions. We won't have time to go through them all, but I've picked and I apologize, I've reworded some of these questions for you guys. There was a notion that stress impacts user awareness. So do we think that companies will start limiting stress that their employees face as a security measure?
It's a great way of thinking about it, because stressed persons make mistakes. Scared persons make mistakes. And we've seen both of this during this unusual time that we're living right now. Many of the attack mechanisms like phishing messages or malicious attachment that we're being sent are built to scare the users, which means they don't think through what's happening. They just click. They get scared, they click. They're stressed, they're clicked. They will click at the link or click at the attachment. And fixing this is hard. Like making people less stressed or making people less scared isn't just something you can do with a flick of a switch. It isn't just something you can educate people out of. It is a much longer term problem, but it's a great question, and it's something we should be thinking more about, not just about technical things and not just about educating users for the traditional mechanisms, but also thinking about how do we make users cope with things like stress better so they would be more secure in their computing.
Thank you. Another question was, have these recent attacks, Tomi, that you were talking about, maybe the threat landscape Christine was mentioning, have they changed what companies need to be doing to stay safe, or does the old advice still apply?
To be honest, a lot of the old advice, they still apply. But of course, there are new things. For example, if we need to say one thing that could be new, it's that the way we store our data today, because there's a lot of data exfiltration that has been happening already. So it's not enough to just have backups. It's not enough to just ensure that, okay, the data that I have here, they have to be living behind servers that are not vulnerable. It also means that we need to ensure that when we store the data, our critical assets, as Tomi has mentioned, that we have different ways of storing them. That, for example, you don't store them plainly as just normal data. If we can store them and encrypt them during storage, that's even better, because if they get exfiltrated, for instance, then they're not easily accessible. So maybe, I guess that's one new advice that could help address the data exfiltration part, this new fresh thing that's happening. And Mikko has an additional advice for you guys.
There's an important consideration regarding long-term storage of data, which is particular to medical information. There's basically no other type of information which stays explosive as long as medical information. I recently was looking at some of the old storages we have, and I found an old email archive backup from a removable SideQuest hard drive, which contained the email archives of F-Secure from 1994. Very interesting stuff, none of which is secret anymore. You could basically post that on public internet, and it's more like a historical archive. The same thing doesn't apply to medical information. For example, therapy notes. Those will have to be kept secret as long as anybody mentioned in those notes is alive, which could mean 100 years. And I'm not sure if we fully understood what it means to store data so it's accessible and useful, but also secure and encrypted for that length of a time. We have big challenges.
Thank you. While you're talking about medical data, there was a comment that maybe we're seeing these breaches and leakages of medical data just so that governments and entities like that will have a plausible excuse to why their surveillance databases are full of people's private information. Would you like to comment on that?
You're the expert on conspiracy theories.
No, we don't want to comment on that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Excellent question. We'll skip the question.
Perfect. Tomi, how worried should I be that someone will target my company specifically?
I kind of partially already answered that one. So nowadays, it's like previously it used to be that people thought it more like it's only the data or only the access that we have. But nowadays, it could be just the resources that maybe you have your cloud posture that is interesting, or the resources that could be employed. Like for crypto mining or similar type of thing. So I think that the old notion that everybody's more or less a target still holds true.
The last question I want to ask you guys is, and maybe I'd like to hear all your opinions. I know Mikko will have an opinion on this. Was it right that Vastaamo went bankrupt? We saw them almost trying to hide the fact that they were breached for a little bit there. What do you think about this?
I mentioned earlier that typically the end result is that when companies get hacked, the companies survive. It might just be the top managers or the CEOs, CISOs, CIOs who get fired. Companies survive, but the leaders don't. That's quite typical. In this case, that didn't happen. In this case, the management was replaced, but then even after that, the whole company went bankrupt. However, looking at what really went down here, like when we're speaking about such a crucial level of trust that the patients gave to this organization, to this private company to safeguard their information, the private notes that they've told in confidence to their therapists, the fact that they failed to safeguard that and they clearly had shortcomings in their IT security sort of makes it fair in my book to see that they actually took also the responsibility for that in the effect of going under and actually collapsing. And here I don't want to put any of the blame on the therapists. The therapists were doing their job, using the IT system they were given. They were actually victims themselves. The patients and the therapists were victims. The company and the people who built the IT system were unable to safeguard it and were also failing in disclosing hacks that they had seen in their system. They paid the price, and I think they paid a fair price.
All right, thank you guys for your presentations today, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar. Hope to see you here next time. Thank you.